Good morning. I'm Leah Zaburbi, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm your worship associate this morning. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Huntington. Hello to those of you who are watching on Zoom now or later on YouTube. If you are new to our congregation and want to speak with someone to learn more about us, please visit our membership table in the social hall or speak with one of the people who greeted you on your way in. Note that our services are varied. With 3 Sundays a month, our services are led by our contract minister, Pastor Madeline. And one Sunday like today, we have guest speakers. So we hope you'll come more than once. I want to note that our speakers today, members Christina Heinemann and Jim Ammerman, actually gave this service in July. But we had tech issues that day, so there's no record of it. So we decided that it was a good idea to give this service again today, and it's a topic that has even more resonance now that the election is over. And know that whoever you are, whomever you love, and wherever you are on your life's journey, you are welcome here.
Good morning. I am Christina Heinemann, and my pronouns are she and her. In addition to Lisa and I, today's service will be led by Jim Ammerman. I have some opening words for us today, written by Kenneth L. Patton. This house is for the ingathering of nature and human nature. It is a house of friendships, a haven in trouble, an open room for the encouragement of our struggle. It is a house of freedom, guarding the dignity and worth of every person. It offers a platform for the free voice, for declaring, both in times of security and danger, the full and undivided conflict of opinion. It is a house of truth-seeking, where scientists can encourage devotion to their quest, where mystics can abide in a community of searchers. It is a house of art, adorning its celebrations with melodies and handiworks. It is a house of prophecy, outrunning times past and times present in visions of growth and progress. This house is a cradle for our dreams, the workshop of our common endeavor.
As Bridget comes forward to light our chalice, the symbol of our faith, I share with you these words from Albert Schweitzer. At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lighted the flame within us. Please join me in saying our mission statement. The words will be on the screen. In religious community, we nurture our individual spirits through caring for one another and helping to heal the world. I invite you now to rise, embody our spirit, and join us in singing our first hymn, number 347, Gather the Spirit. There are gray hymnals on the side for those of you who would like to have one to sing with. You are invited to light a candle for something deep in your heart this morning. I believe, Martha, are you here? Martha was my pastoral care associate. If a pastoral care associate is in the room, may you please come forward. Thank you, Sue. Sue will join us in the front. She has a basket of cards for joys and concerns you'd like shared with the congregation. She also has blank cards and pens if you'd like to write something now. As the music plays, I invite you to come forward or go to the candle table in the back. For our nation that is holding its breath for what comes next, and for those of us who are still reeling from the shock of it all. I ask for a moment of silence as we think about the names that are close to our hearts, and for those we hold dear. Let us open our minds and hearts to the place of quiet, to the silent prayer for the healing of pain and the soft, gentle coming of love. Please join me in singing Spirit of Life. The words are on the screen. We will not be having a time for all ages today, so we will now sing our children to their classrooms.
If his life and career teaches us anything, it is how quickly democracy can be prized from its hinges when political institutions fail and civilized forces in society are too weak to combat the lure of authoritarianism. From the book by Volker Ulrich, Hitler, Downfall, 1939 to 1945. Writing in 1927, in an article titled The Use of the 50%er, my grandfather, Hans Heinemann, reflected on his time in the US and his roots in Germany. By the standards of the Better America Foundation or the National Security League, I am but a 50%er, perhaps even less. I have been in this country but 4 years and can never be elected president. Perhaps it is presumption to try to tell my impressions about this country. My cradle stood in that part of Germany once inhabited by the fierce Saxons of the days of Charlemagne. I come from a family that has been prominent in local affairs for a century, that was well-to-do and cultured. The town in which I spent my early years was one of those very old and quaint places with narrow, winding streets indelibly stamped by the ages that had lived and died there. My education was not neglected, and an extensive travel through Europe served to round it out. I belonged to the Wandervogel section of the German youth movement, and in the free and unconventional companionship of this group, I learned to look for the beautiful in life and nature, to get joy and happiness out of being alive. Then came the war, and the course I should normally have followed was totally changed. After the agonized suffering of the war years and the gnawing starvation of the afterwar, it seemed to many of us that the last word had been written in great tragedy. No matter how one worked and suffered, all seemed in vain. To stay on in the country which had nurtured one seemed to serve but one purpose, to bury the dead and to sing a dirge for the stricken land. It was too hard for youth. In the spirit of adventure, with the purpose of starting all over, I took a boat and came to America. What Hans did not say in this piece was that he was Jewish, and from a centuries-old German Jewish family with a proud and rich history in the north of Germany, in Lüneburg, a medieval city rich in salt deposits, salt that could be traded across the Hanseatic League, a trade that made Lüneburg a relatively wealthy city. A German Jewish family that had done well but faced discrimination. In the 19th century, one family member was excluded from the local textile guild for 10 years and only accepted once he had a Gentile sponsor him. And what Hans could not have known in 1927 was that 14 descendants of his grandparents, Marcus and Henrietta Heinemann, would be murdered in the Holocaust in the 1940s. That one of his older sisters, Dr. Lotte Heinemann, a pediatrician with a practice in Lüneburg, would be harassed by non-Jewish colleagues in the mid-1930s, to the point that she left Germany and, with sponsorship by her brother Hans, would immigrate to the US and to New York City. And I knew very little of this Jewish history, this family Jewish history myself, until 2015, when a German historian working for the City Museum in Lüneburg, Annika de Ruyter, reached out to the heirs of Marcus and Henrietta Heinemann, my great-great-grandparents. Marcus and Henrietta were parents to 17 children, the oldest of which was Robert Simon Heinemann, my great-grandfather. As a quick aside, Annika's stepdaughter, Charlotte Graves, a composer and jazz musician, composed the prelude Dylan played at the start of the service. The museum in Lüneburg, Marcus had been a benefactor of the museum in his day, asked Annika to find Marcus's heirs to return items in its collection that had been stolen from his estate in the 1940s by the Nazis. This was Providence work. In this context, we found just about all of Marcus's descendants that were now living in England, France, Israel, South Africa, the Netherlands, Germany, and in the US. In July 2015, 40 of us gathered in Lüneburg, not really for a reunion because most of us had not met before, but for a family gathering. We visited landmarks of Jewish history in Lüneburg, the site of the first synagogue in Lüneburg, which had been replaced by a much larger synagogue in the 1890s. The homes where our grandparents and great-grandparents had lived and grown up in, the school they attended, the Johanneum that was founded in 1406, and so much more. What we also did in a moving ceremony as an extended family was to loan the items from Marcus's estate back to the museum for 10 years and realistically for an indefinite period. In the Marcus Heinemann collection, there are old coins, an old chest, stained glass, and the family Hebrew Bible. Where else would or should these items be with families spread across multiple countries and multiple continents, other than in Lüneburg? In this ceremony, the Museum Association asked for our forgiveness.
The youngest descendants read from our statement.
In 2014, the Lüneburg Museum reached out to its heirs, telling us they were once again honoring Marcus Heinemann and his family. They also wanted us to know that the museum had in its collection Heinemann family items that were looted by the Nazis. Although most of us have not yet met one another, those of us who have corresponded agreed to a 10-year loan of these items to the museum.
The gesture by the heirs was really what made this whole process possible, which had the side of healing and really reconciliation aspect.
We are greatly indebted to you, dear members of the Heinemann family, who have most kindly consented to accept our late restitution of those formerly expropriated objects. In saying that I'm happy to talk to you, I nevertheless must admit that I don't feel too comfortable about it. Looking back at those shameful years of our past, during which your ancestors were humiliated, deprived of their property, and deported.
When we started with this process in the society, of course, there were people saying that throws a bad light on our former director. But it is so important to say that we have the responsibility for what happened at the time.
On behalf of our museum society, I hereby ask your forgiveness.
Jim and I returned to Lüneburg in 2018 when the city dedicated a new marker at the site of the synagogue that had been built in 1890, and of significance and meaning to the Heinemann family, had been largely financed by Marcus Heinemann, but was then torn down by the Nazis in 1938 at the expense of its members. The site had been recognized by a single stone marker placed there in the early 1950s by a small Jewish community that included survivors of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp and displaced persons who came mainly from Eastern Europe. The stone marker still stands today, but is now surrounded by a memorial to the Jewish families that once lived in Lüneburg, and also to the families whose members were among the 40 Jews taken from Lüneburg and murdered in the Holocaust. In the last almost 10 years, I have learned a tremendous amount about my family history, an embarrassment of genealogical riches, albeit in the context of one of the most tragic of circumstances, the Holocaust. Annika de Ruyter, the German historian hired by the Lüneburg Museum in 2014, has played a huge role in revealing and sharing this family history. It is and has been a professional commitment on Annika's part, but it has also been so much more, an act of generosity and love. As the Obermeyer Foundation wrote in its profile of Annika, Annika de Ruyter has the empathy to recognize empty spaces in Germany where Jewish life once flourished, and she has dedicated herself to reconnecting people to their own history and filling those voids, at least symbolically. This could not be a truer statement. In 2023, Becky Cohn-Vargas, my second cousin, with letters of support from myself and many others, nominated Annika for an Obermeyer Award. I promised that if Annika won, we would go to Berlin in the heart of winter in January for the ceremony. She did, and off we went to Berlin for the official award ceremony on January 29th, 2024, at the Red Town Hall. In the 1990s, as he traveled in Germany, Arthur Obermeyer saw that many non-Jewish German citizens were doing all sorts of remembrance work to document Jewish life that once existed in their country. In response to what he witnessed, Arthur created the Obermeyer Award. Arthur was an American scientist, entrepreneur, activist, philanthropist, and a man that liked to start things, as his son Joel often says about him. He started the award program to recognize and honor non-Jewish German citizens who had done extraordinary work to preserve the Jewish history and heritage in their local communities. Arthur wanted their good works to be recognized by their families, their communities, and their country. Arthur also wanted to demonstrate to Jews throughout the world that Germany today is very, very different from the Germany of Hitler's era. So in addition to the amazing gift of all of the family history I've learned, I too have been impressed with the scale of public remembrance work in current-day Germany. While in Berlin this past January, we were fortunate to visit several sites where remembrance work is ongoing and in some cases is done by school children as young as 10 or 11. Some of the descriptions I will share here are excerpts written by the Obermeyer Foundation. In 1993, Gunther Demnig, an artist in Cologne, conceived of Stolperstein, or stumbling stones that are neatly paved into sidewalk. They compel those who walk by to stop and read the words, "Here lived," and the name, date, and place of death of an individual killed by the Nazis. What Demnig began in 1993 is becoming the largest monument to the victims of National Socialism. It is a constantly expanding mosaic. It is for all the victims, says Demnig, Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and resistance fighters. This basic information about the fate of one person among 6 million has the power to create questions in the minds of pedestrians. In many cities, towns, and even villages, just the idea to set a stone starts a new wave of discussion and research about the Nazi past. Not only do relatives and descendants of victims contact Demnig, schools, associations, and other groups apply for official permission to add blocks as well. At Max Planck Elementary School in Berlin, a class started one of many projects inspired by Demnig. To prepare for the installation of the stumbling blocks, students researched archives, talked with historians, and interviewed survivors and their families to learn about the time in which they lived. As of January 2022, there were over 90,000 Stolpersteine in more than 25 countries, and there is now a waiting list of at least 2 years. Sabet Mittals is a teacher at the Theodor Heuss Community School in Berlin. Many of the students at her school have roots in other countries. Many came from war-torn areas in the Middle East. Some are not yet German citizens, and others are officially refugees without promise of a permanent home. They often know little or nothing about Germany, let alone the history of the Holocaust. Many have experienced discriminations themselves. Sabat's aim is to empower her students to combat hate and anti-Semitism and to use creative teaching methods that combine sensitivity and empathy. On the 81st anniversary of Kristallnacht, the anti-Jewish pogrom of November 1938, pupils filed out of the Theodor Heuss Community School and crossed the street for a ceremony at the site of the former freight train station from which some 30,000 Jews were deported from between 1942 and 1944. Today, a section of track called Track 69 has a memorial to mark the spot. The granddaughter of one of those deported, Rosa Marshall, born in London to parents who fled Nazi Germany, was among the many who laid flowers on the track on November 9th, 2019, the 81st anniversary of Kristallnacht. Jim and I did the same in January of this year. When she became principal of the Locknitz Primary School in the Schöneberg district of Berlin in 1994, Krista Nicholson and a colleague devised a teaching plan. They used a memorial book that listed more than 6,000 Jews that had lived in the neighborhood and been killed in concentration camps. The school's sixth graders were instructed to pick a person who interested them. Some chose people that had lived on their street or with whom they shared a birthday. As it happened, a building was being constructed near Nicholson's home with yellow bricks. She acquired a handful for her project. Students then wrote the name, birth date, and place of death on their bricks. Then they placed the bricks, 25 in all, in the schoolyard, the start of a wall that would grow a bit each year. As each student presented a brick, he or she would say, "I think of this person because," and state some information about the person. Today, the project called Demcall on Judist Mitbürger, a wordplay that literally means memorial, think about our Jewish neighbors, has become a highly anticipated tradition. Students have laid 1,500 bricks, and there's plenty of room for more. And unlike walls aimed at keeping people out, this one has attracted visitors around the world interested in this unique project and the school's approach to teaching Jewish history. All of this experience has been incredibly moving, in many ways for me transformative, because I knew so little of my family history in Germany before 2015. This last trip to Germany motivated me to pursue placement of a stumbling stone outside the house where my grandfather grew up and where his older sister, Lottie, had her pediatric practice. Lottie was not taken from the house and murdered, but she was harassed and driven away by her non-Jewish colleagues in the mid-1930s, something that might be worth marking and remembering in the current day and age. Personally, I think to myself, what would my grandfather Hans think about his granddaughter placing a stumbling stone outside the house he grew up in? Even prior to 2015, my grandfather Hans loomed large in the lives of his descendants. I believe Hans was proudly German first, his Jewishness largely hidden from his American family. Hans certainly had his reasons for not sharing his Jewish heritage, no doubt connected to the fact that anti-Semitism in the US, in New York City and in suburban Connecticut, where he worked and lived, was alive and well, some might even say rampant, in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s as he was building his family life and career. But what if I symbolically pulled back that curtain in some small way to mark a piece of the suffering that occurred? It couldn't have been easy for Lottie to uproot herself and come to the US and have to reestablish herself professionally. And she was one of the truly very lucky ones to have been able to do this. So much depends on us remembering. Germany has made a national commitment to remember. Perhaps we should too.
Thank you, Dylan. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Ammerman, as Christina has described, and her lesser half. I want to talk about remembrance work in the United States. As I said up there, better late than never. It has been slower to occur than in Germany, and I'm going to talk about how it's both directly and indirectly connected to remembrance work in Germany and the story that Christina has told. So I want to start with a quote from Helen Keller, which you can read. "The continued lynchings and crimes against Negroes, whether in New England or the South, and unspeakable political exponents of white supremacy, according to all recorded history, augur ill for America's future." And that's from 1946. Now you may wonder why I picked out a quote from Helen Keller. Well, it turned out that Oscar Heinemann, the seventh child of Marcus and Henrietta, who immigrated to the US in the 1890s, settled in Chicago and established himself as a silk merchant. He left his entire fortune to the Helen Keller Foundation. So there's the connection with the Heinemann family in Germany right there. Okay, there's a book called Learning from the Germans. It's written by Susan Neiman, a Jewish-American moral philosopher who grew up in the South and has lived in Germany for decades. She's the director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam. She has a quote at the beginning of the book: "I begin life as a white girl in the segregated South, and I'm likely to end it as a Jewish woman in Berlin." You may or may not be aware that the Nazis based many of their notorious race laws, the Nuremberg laws, on the Jim Crow laws from the US. These laid the legal framework for persecution of the Jews during the Holocaust and World War II. They were different in many ways. There are significant parallels between the Holocaust in Germany and the slavery, lynching, and Jim Crow era in the US, not to mention the past treatment of Native Americans here. Though it took some time and a generation or two after World War II, Germany has made significant progress in atoning for its crimes during the Holocaust, as we've seen in Christina's presentation. The US, in contrast, has been rather slow to acknowledge our past and can learn some lessons from the Germans. That said, today not all is well in Germany. There is a growing anti-immigrant movement, particularly in the East. The war in Gaza has complicated Germany's support for Israel, and the government has recently collapsed and called for new elections. So they have their own issues. So Christina mentioned the Obermeyer Foundation and the Obermeyer Awards. A piece of that is the Widen the Circle program. And this is a network that the Obermeyer Foundation has started to connect people doing remembrance work in Germany with those in the US and elsewhere, particularly focused on the younger generation. So I want to show a brief video by Brian Stevenson. You may be aware of him as the American lawyer who wrote the book Just Mercy and founded the Equal Justice Initiative. And he discusses his remembrance experiences in both Germany and the US in this video. I'll caution you, there's a scene of lynching in the video.
I think it's important that we recognize the activities of people who are pushing our communities, our neighborhoods, our nations to not only remember, but to appreciate what's important about these memories, what's significant, what was lost, and what we need to learn and what we need to gain. We are trying to change the narrative in the American South. Our landscape is littered with the iconography of the Confederacy. The architects and defenders of slavery are actually romanticized and celebrated. We have holidays dedicated to the memory of people who were perpetrators of some of these great atrocities. We haven't talked very much about slavery. We haven't talked about lynching. We don't talk about the Jim Crow and segregation that humiliated and marginalized so many. And so I think that has to change. And I've been really interested in trying to understand, how do we change the narrative? How do we overcome this history of violence and bigotry and racism and destruction? And in that effort, I've been able to travel. And the most meaningful thing I did was I went to Germany. And my time in Berlin was transformational. And I walked around the city and I encountered the stumbling stones, which disrupted the landscape in this really powerful way. It became clear to me that you can't go very far in Berlin without seeing symbols, signs, monuments, markers, memorials that are designed to make sure that we never forget what happened during that terrible time. And then I had the extraordinary experience in my walking around to encounter this simple but powerful wall of yellow bricks put together by children. It was the hopefulness of a generation of young people feeling the need to express their grief, their sorrow, but their hope that we never again tolerate the kind of bigotry and bias that gave rise to the Holocaust. And knowing that this yellow wall, and I like that it's yellow, it has the kind of energy of youth, it has the kind of hopefulness of youth to respond in their own unique way to the challenges created by this history, this past. And in many ways, it has been a source of inspiration for the work that we're now trying to do. We are trying to disrupt the landscape in the American South. We want to complicate these ideas that things were wonderful and glorious during the time of enslavement or lynching. And seeing the stumbling stones, seeing the stones has been one of the most meaningful influences in that work. We also decided to build the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is a 6-acre site dedicated to thousands of victims of lynching. It's the first comprehensive memorial to victims of lynching in America. And we name these thousands of people because for too long they've been unknown. They've never been remembered. And we tell a story about the weight of that era. And when you enter our memorial, the monuments, which are 6 feet tall, that replicate the human body in one way, they're rectangular, but they're also scarred and blemished, and we have the names of people organized by county, and you encounter them in the first quarter at eye level. We want you to have that intimacy, and I've been there, and I've seen families that have come back to the American South to look for their loved one's name, and you see people embracing those monuments, and it's very powerful. And then in the second quarter, these monuments begin to rise because this history still hovers over us, it shadows us. And when you get to the third quarter, you see all of these monuments suspended because the tragedy of this era was that those who perpetrated this violence didn't try to hide it. They didn't try to deny it. They actually lifted up these battered, bloody bodies to terrorize other people. They wanted to taunt and torment communities of color, and that left a real injury. It created real anguish. And we want people to understand that. And then we have a wall that talks about the importance of remembering. And then we leave the square and we have duplicates of all of the monuments that are designed to urge each of these communities to engage in their own remembrance work. And we're actually now putting up markers and distributing monuments across the region so that in every county where there has been this history, there'll be some visible testament to the history. And for us, this community remembrance work is part of what we think is essential about how we change the narrative in America. Because I think if we can make the landscape complicit in creating a new relationship to our history, if we can get communities to understand the power of talking about this history, and most importantly, if we can create a new generation of young children, like the sixth graders that created that yellow brick wall, we can actually create a hope for the future, that we will never again be governed by fear and anger. We will never again let bigotry and bias shape our thinking, our relationship to one another. So it's a great honor to have some small role in acknowledging the work of all of you, terrific advocates, activists, teachers, citizens who are doing the great work that you're doing, but to congratulate you each for the remarkable work you've done and this extraordinary night celebrating the Obermeyer Awards.
Okay, now I want some brief audience participation. How many people had heard of Juneteenth before it was declared a holiday? About half, okay. Yeah, I lived in Texas for 12 years, so I knew about Juneteenth. And it remembers the fact that the Union troops carrying the message of emancipation did not arrive on Texas at Galveston until June 19th, 1865, which was 2.5 years after the Declaration of the Emancipation. It took that long. So, and there were more than 250,000 enslaved blacks in the state of Texas who were freed by that decree. And it took the U.S. 156 years to recognize it as a national holiday, although, as I said, it was previously well known, certainly in Texas and the African-American community. We also learned last night at the event for the Huntington African-American Museum that Huntington was a stop on the Underground Railroad. So I thought I should make that known. And throughout the rest of what I have to say, I'm going to highlight some other remembrance-related activities in the U.S. that Christina and I actually have connections to. So I want to talk about the Reconstruction Era National Historic Park. This is in Beaufort, South Carolina. And you may be aware that Reconstruction, largely known as the period from 1865 to 1877, marked an era of hope, uncertainty, and struggle. Formerly enslaved people sought to reunify families, establish schools, run for a political office, and push legislation, and even sue slaveholders for compensation. But that ended rather abruptly in 1877 when the federal government withdrew federal troops from the South as part of the Compromise of 1877. However, in Beaufort, Reconstruction started earlier and lasted longer. It's considered from 1861 to 1900. And so now, recently was established this Reconstruction Era National Monument first in the waning days of the Obama administration. And legislation passed by Congress in 2019 redesignated the monument to a National Historic Park. Now we have connections to this because the former mayor of Beaufort, Billy Kaiserling, who was very instrumental in pushing this forward, is the cousin of my brother-in-law, Tom Kaiserling. And Billy was a very popular mayor for several terms in Beaufort, who ran unopposed, was very well known, and was a major figure in pushing this effort. The picture on the right actually shows where the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation occurred. This is in Port Royal, South Carolina, about 5 miles away from Beaufort, where the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, which was a black Union Army regiment, was stationed. Okay, the next quiz is, How many of you have heard of the African American burial ground in New York City? Again, about half. So in 1991, the federal government was constructing a 34-story federal office tower positioned at 290 Broadway and overseen by the GSA. And part of the federal requirements for construction projects are mandated to determine any potential archaeological and cultural impacts of construction. So excavation for this building, which is where Christina works when she goes into the office, found intact human skeletal remains located 30 feet below the street level on Broadway. And the survey work showed that this was the largest and most important discovery of a Negro burial ground, a 6-acre site containing upwards of 15,000 intact skeletal remains of enslaved and free Africans who lived and worked in colonial New York. This burial ground was used between the 1630s and 1795 and is the largest one discovered in the U.S. In February of 2006, George W. Bush declared it a national monument. Has anyone been there to see it? Okay, a couple people. So, and Christina's office, as I said, is in that building, and they actually had to alter the design to accommodate the burial ground. And now you can take tours of the site. Okay, I want to conclude. What was that? I want to conclude with a description of the Tulsa Race Massacre and Christy Williams. Christy is an advocate for Black history in Oklahoma, where she teaches a program called Black History Saturdays. She was part of our Widen the Circle program last January in Berlin, and she's a descendant of survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921. She's also recently compiled a library of all the banned books in Oklahoma, which is 50 and increasing, I think. So she's also recently been awarded by the National Geographic Society as an Explorer and a Wayfinder Award for pushing the frontiers of science, conservation, education, technology, and storytelling. So she's been an active part of the Widen the Circle network. A group of the students that Christina mentioned near that railroad track also were on a trip the summer of 23 and visited Tulsa, actually. So that's another connection. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Each week we have an offering for our split plate program, which means that the undesignated donations are split between the UUFH and our charity of the month, unless you indicate otherwise. In active support of changing the narrative of the history of our own town, this month we're supporting the Huntington African American Museum. Their mission, that's true, their mission is to provide a forum for those interested in African American history and culture to explore and celebrate the contributions of African American lifestyle, culture, art, and traditions through education, exhibits, and programs with an emphasis on Huntington's African American history. In our way of ensuring that this happens, we had a very active and joyous event last night, a fundraiser to support the museum's building. So today, ushers will be passing baskets while Dylan plays, and for those of you at home, you can send a check to the office or donate through the website, Zelle, or PayPal. And thank you all for the support you give for the work we do both within and beyond these walls.
I was enjoying the music too much. In closing, we share these words written by Timothy Schneider, the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University, in his book on Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Number 16, learn from peers in other countries. Keep your friendships abroad or make new friends in other countries. The present difficulties in the United States are an element of a larger trend, and no country is going to find a solution by itself. Make sure you and your family have passports. Please rise as you are willing and able to sing when the Spirit says do. If you're using a hymnal, the teal hymnal, please follow the slides for the words rather than the hymnal. Thank you.
So we have some announcements. We always have lots of announcements. Today is the monthly potluck in the social hall, and I invite you just simply to follow the scent of the food, and you'll find it. The Environmental Justice, Social Justice, and Grow to Give Garden teams invite you to join us at Cinema Arts Center for a screening of Common Ground this Wednesday at November 20th. It'll be at 7 p.m. 7:30. It'll be followed by guest speakers. Next Saturday, November 23rd at 10 a.m. is the next Creativity Matters meeting. It's an intergenerational gathering in the social hall where we explore creativity through a theme. And this month it is Living Love Through the Practice of Repair. And you can learn more about that in the flash or contact Danielle Burby. And our safety committee has asked me to mention that they've been revising some of their procedures to accommodate Sunday service attendees who need accessible parking. We have several accessible parking spots on the front parking lot and several in the back as well. So the doors will be open to the back, leading to the main hall from 10 to 10:25. So try to park there first and then fill into the front. These, and it's a lot longer, but it's in the flash. These and other announcements are in the weekly newsletter, so sign up at UUFH.org if you don't yet get it, because we are a busy congregation with very many things happening, and we invite you to participate. I want to thank Christina and Jim for their service today, which they have done not once, but twice. So my grandmother said that everything happens in threes, so I don't know. And have a peaceful, wonderful day. Thank you, Dylan, for your music. And let's listen to his postlude and have a great day.